Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to RVN's show, What the Why with Barbara Ann. In case you haven't seen us before, we're in season 2, and our show still features conversations with diverse leaders from all walks of life about why they do what they do and how they figured things out. Maybe at some point in your life, you got sick and tired of being sick and tired, or maybe you just feel stuck and you want to get unstuck, whether it's in your personal life or your career, your company, a relationship. Whatever the case, all of our guests have something in common with you. At some point in their life, they felt similarly, and they decided to make a change. And today's guest is no exception to that. So I'm really excited that Belle Walker is joining us live from California. Belle is the founder and lead consultant at Bellevue Consulting, and Belle's journey is a little bit unique. She found her purpose when she transitioned from engineering projects and data to engineering organizational change, or as she likes to say, from friction to function. Belle's company, Bellevue Consulting, which she started 11 years ago, helps startups take a proactive approach to their organizational structure and culture. They support executive leaders in quantifying their challenges and identifying the paths to their specific goals. With ongoing support, Bellevue helps maintain strong results through growth, market cycles, and the many surprises that can pop up on any given day. Before starting her own company, Belle served as the engineering director of quality, efficiency, and data accuracy, as well as the Berkeley site lead for HERE, H-E-R-E, Technologies, a role she rose to through the ranks from her first position with the company as the manager of air and space. Before that, she held other roles in marketing and project management and customer relations, while also working on her Master of Science candidate in systems architecting and engineering at the University of Southern California, which she eventually completed that degree with a 4.0 and earned. In addition to her master's degree, Belle also holds a bachelor's degree in engineering sciences from Harvard University, the Harvard. Some of her other activities include serving as a course instructor in software quality assurance for UC Berkeley Extension. She's also a board member for inclusive, how could I get that wrong? I'm in it. Inclusive Leadership in a Virtual World, which is how we met. And she's also a mom. And I'm thrilled she's joining us via Zoom, as I mentioned, all the way from California. So without further ado, please help me welcome Belle Walker. So a round of applause. Yay! So welcome, Belle.
Thank you so much, Barbara Ann. It is delightful to be here with you.
And I'm glad we were able to make this happen. And believe it or not, next week is our 1-year anniversary. So you're our final episode of the year, even though you're actually in our second season. So I just ran through the list, and you've seen the show. You're familiar with the format. You've done a lot in your relatively short period of time on Earth. But I'm curious to know what young Belle wanted to be when she grew up. So what did you want to be when you grew up?
So the answer varies depending how young we're talking. I definitely went through a long phase in middle and junior high, middle school and junior high, where I wanted to be a teacher. And then I got to high school and realized that kids can be jerks. So decided maybe that wasn't as appealing. And I ended up deciding I wanted to be an astronaut, which I think is kind of the opposite from how a lot of people think about those careers. But it was a really wonderful aspiration because, at least at the time, the youngest astronaut who had ever been selected to a class was 28 when they were selected. And that is young, let's be clear. However, when you are 18, that seems really old. And so to be selected for an astronaut, you had to basically do a lot of interesting things. That was the heart of the criteria. And so it was basically this mandate to go out into the world and pursue passions until I was old enough to try and be an astronaut.
Wow. And it's interesting because I wanted to do a lot of different things when I was little too, right? But astronaut was one of the things that was on my list of things I would love to have done. And so you wanted to be an astronaut. So how did we get from wanting to be an astronaut and looking at the world from up above to doing what you do now, which is helping organizations change from friction to function?
It has been a journey, and I should probably clarify that anytime NASA wants me, I'm there. Astronaut is definitely still on the table.
Awesome.
But it really comes back to the following passions piece. Even in college, when I was working on mechanical engineering for my degree, I spent probably 40 hours a week at the theater stage managing, mostly musicals, which I absolutely love. And that gave me a whole bunch of project management experience. So I ended up finding, sort of stumbling my way into this amazing opportunity at Google right out of school, where I was building out an operation, project managing pretty much right off the bat. And coming fresh out of mechanical engineering, I started to realize that a lot of the words overlap for a reason. So we talk about org structures and mechanical structures, and a lot of the principles really apply. And I also learned many lessons while I was there, and several of them I would say I could have skipped with a little more exposure to what other people had done. So I went back to grad school with an eye towards standing on the shoulders of giants and maybe jumping over a few more of those life lessons learned the hard way. And I was lucky to find that systems architecting and engineering program where the dean was very enthusiastic about letting me do my research on organizations as systems.
Oh, which they are.
They absolutely, I would argue, they're the most complex systems
Yes.
humans are likely to build.
Yes, because humans aren't just difference engines.
No, they're really not. And so in grad school, I was introduced to this concept of scientific management, which has this very fancy name and makes it sound like the work I describe, except it has this nuance where it assumes that people are like interchangeable cogs in a machine. And it served a purpose at its time. It helped drive a degree of rigorous thinking that didn't exist before. And people are not interchangeable cogs in a machine. That is utter nonsense. I think we all have learned that lesson. However, cogs are not interchangeable cogs in a machine. You don't get to open your watch, swap around the gears, and expect it to work just as well as it did before. And so something that really became clear to me was that I think these early oversimplifications have turned a lot of people off to the idea of bringing these more engineering scientific approaches into the business world. So I was pretty excited to do that as soon as I graduated.
Which is awesome. And so as you're learning this, but you're working in these highly scientific roles, how did you make that transition from taking what you knew in school and applying that in the workplace?
Yeah, well, you mentioned that I founded the company about 11 years ago now, and I did found the company. I even did some consulting work for the first few years the company existed, but bluntly, I got cold feet. I graduated and struck out on my own, got terrified, and went scrambling off to work for other organizations. And so it gave me this baseline opportunity, that kind of unfinished hook that I knew I wanted to come back to. And at the same time, allowed me to really put into practice and test these theories that I had been researching in the academic context.
Wow.
So I did build more teams for a whole bunch of different organizations. And then at one point, I found myself getting kind of burned out. And I realized that I was burned out on the work that aligned with my job title,
Mm-hmm.
but I was really enjoying peer coaching and working with other organizations in my company to do exactly this kind of intentional sort of operating system, operating model design for how teams were structured, how they interacted, how they could design for the constraints that they were facing while creating opportunities for success for those unique individuals who were part of the team. And so at that point, I took a sabbatical, got that burned outness out of my system,
Okay.
and then dove full time into consulting just in time for the pandemic.
Okay. Now you say you took a sabbatical and got that out of your system. It sounds like part of that was overcoming the fear of really going all in on what you were most passionate about and where you believed your purpose to be. What did you do during your sabbatical, or how did you use that time to find the courage to say, nope, this is what I want to do, and I'm going to go for it?
That is one of those questions where, in retrospect, it seems like it was fairly easy at the time. It was very intimidating, honestly. And so, what I scheduled during the sabbatical was a bunch of travel by myself. I got to travel with my mother, with my grandmother, which was truly wonderful. And during those travels, especially, I would meet new people, and I had a chance to practice saying, I'm Belle, and I'm a consultant."
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like a small moment. What do you put on a customs form when you go into a new country and they ask for your occupation? But it went a really long way towards helping me to begin to understand that I do have something to bring to other people, and I want to give it a chance to really get it out there. So I guess the short version is to say I practiced explaining that I was a consultant and laying that mental foundation so that by the time I really was out looking for clients, I was ready.
Mm-hmm. And now here you are, 11 years. To the extent that you can talk about some of the things you've done with your clients, how have you helped them along their journeys in moving from friction to function?
Yeah, I tend to apply what I think of as a very engineering-driven approach. I'm happy to share the process. I'm about to do it right now because the more people who do this, I think the happier the world will be. So it starts with really making sure you understand what the friction is. What are the sources? What are the challenges? What's the problem you're trying to solve? And there's a tool in engineering, mostly process engineering, the 5 whys, where you ask why, and then why is that, and why is that. And that's very similar to what I often do with my clients just to start out, to really figure out what is it that needs attention and maybe needs some engineering. We also look at what are their constraints. And oftentimes I think the word constraint gets a bit of a negative connotation, but for me, I think constraints are beautiful because the world is an infinite realm of possibilities. And it's so easy to get overwhelmed unless you can start to zero in on reasons why this little corner is where our ideal is going to be. So we figure out the constraints and we look at the resources, and that's often where the people piece comes in. If we know we are going to make a home for Barbara Ann where she can thrive and excel, that is both a constraint and a resource and an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And when we have all of that laid out, we know what we're trying to solve, we know what we're bringing to the table, the constraints we're working within, often the engineering piece is fairly straightforward. And this is something that a lot of teams can do for themselves. What I think I and other consultants often bring to the table is an outside perspective.
Yeah.
So I, as an executive, could have used me as a consultant to help ask those questions from that place of genuine curiosity and naivety.
Mm-hmm.
So that tends to come across in things like looking at how many layers of depth does an organization need to be successful? How broad a span of control? How many people can one person effectively support in this particular context? And I don't think there are hard and fast rules. I think there are right answers for this team in this moment in this business.
Awesome. Believe it or not, we are already at the halfway point. So we're going to take a quick break, and then afterwards we're going to return with more of our conversation with Belle Walker, the expert who helps take companies from friction to function. Welcome back to What the Why with Barbara Ann, and today's really exciting guest, Belle Walker of the consulting firm. In case you haven't figured out, Belle, I'm very authentic in my errors. So Belle is the founder and owner of Bellevue Consulting, and she went from what some would say the hard sciences of engineering to the softer sciences of engineering, to basically help companies move from friction to function. And before the break, we were talking about how she applies some of those traditional engineering concepts to working with people, because, you know, an organism or an entity is an entity. And people entities are far more complex. So, and you were just talking about before the break, you know, some of the things that you've helped organizations do. To the extent that you can share, what do you think was your biggest challenge in any one of the organizations, or a hybrid storyized version of the organizations that you've worked with over the past 11 plus years?
It's a good question. I don't know about necessarily the biggest challenge, although I would say a theme of many of my favorite challenges have been organizations that are interested in non-traditional organizational structures. And so when I say traditional, I'm referring to the sort of pyramidal hierarchy where there's a CEO who has a C-suite and then teams that branch out from there. But it's not the only way to organize a company. It's one of many. And there's been a rise over the last decade, at least, of different, often referred to as self-organizing teams. And some of these concepts can be a little misleading how they're talked about. So holacracy is very popular, and it gets talked about as self-organizing, which it is, however, still a hierarchy. It's just not pyramidal. There's also versions like the collaborative web, where it's these one-to-one interactions, which is a very different structure. But what I think catches a lot of people off guard is they think that moving away from that traditional pyramidal hierarchy means that you have less structure for individuals to operate in. And in fact, it generally means the opposite. Because in a traditional structure, we all know, we've all been raised culturally, at least in the US, to understand what it means to have a boss and to have a team. And that understanding has evolved in ways that I think are very fortunate around better support for people as individuals. However, there is a shared understanding. And so when you throw that out the window, now you have to be really, really intentional around what it is that you expect from each person showing up and becoming part of this whole new approach to organization.
Oh, wow.
So I love those situations, but they can be challenging.
Yeah, because some of the forms of teams that you're mentioning are things I haven't even learned, and I'm only 6 years out of grad school, so I'm like, wow, things do move quickly. And yeah, it sounds like it could be really challenging for someone to adjust, especially when these are models that are still evolving. There's not a lot of best practices. So if I'm hearing you correctly, they're really relying on you to help them formulate what this is going to look like. And because you are creating outside of the box, yeah, I could see where it would be really intentional and deliberate, making sure that everybody's really clear so that everybody's optimizing their particular position in their cog spot.
Exactly. And I think a lot of what I'm bringing to those conversations is that outside perspective that I mentioned earlier. And especially when a small team evolves into or their own new way of organizing, there becomes a lot of unspoken understandings and expectations that as you expand now need to be spoken. Or at a minimum, somebody needs to be tasked with the speaking. Because if nobody owns those cultural elements, those expectations, people will come in with the expectations they learned at other organizations in completely different contexts. And that's a very fast recipe for conflict and friction.
Yeah, because companies talk about things like making sure there's a culture fit within teams, but this would take that to a whole new level.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's some real advantages, I think, to these systems. One of them is bringing forth the invisible work. I've seen a couple of organizations where they do a really good job of separating out roles from individuals and not having a one-to-one mapping. So, for example, in a traditional company, I usually have a title, maybe it's project manager, maybe it's director or software engineer, whatever it is. There's one, a baseline expectation, but two, there's usually one, maybe two titles that I'm wearing at a given time. In some of these models, they break it down into much smaller pieces, such as career mentoring as one component, which is separate from professional mentoring as a separate component, or celebrations, or actual traditional work pieces of work that all get broken down. And then that way people can job craft, right, is the hip term these days, can build up the expectations for their role, but using this shared terminology, these shared expectations. And as a group, then the team can look at, one, are all our needs being met? And two, who is fulfilling which pieces so that we can actually recognize some of that invisible work that tends to fall on women and minorities in many situations.
In terms of, and I'm just curious, in terms of the job satisfaction around these types of models, what are you seeing or hearing, data seeing, anecdotally hearing?
So anecdotally, so I think there is some more recent research on this that I am not up to speed on. So highly recommend that viewers go and cross-check me on this. But anecdotally, what we see is that the job satisfaction is pretty high through a critical mass for one particular organization. So scaling has been very challenging for a lot of these non-traditional structures. And I think, personally, I think it has to do with the fact that you lose that shorthand that you have when you have that shared cultural expectation coming in. And so being able to train and explain to more and more people at a time what all you mean with your words and your expectations becomes very difficult.
So moving forward in terms of whether there's someone out there watching right now who's saying, you know what, my favorite part of my job in an engineering project management company is actually the coaching and the staff development that I do. What advice would you give to someone who is thinking about making that kind of a transition?
I would say that there's also a really important reflection that I think people sometimes miss around, is that the only part of your job that you're really enjoying? So understanding whether this is an opportunity to shift and adjust versus strike out anew, I think is an important self-reflection. But if you are in a place where you're ready to make the leap, then the advice I would have is go for it. And the more you can do to have at least that first client, that first engagement to really make sure that you love it as much as you think you love it. Because the same way that outside perspective brings a lot of value to clients, it's a very different experience. I miss knowing what all the acronyms mean. I miss having that shared bond and camaraderie that's being part of a larger team. And so if you have a chance to kind of experience what it is to be on the other side of some of those relationships, I'm a big fan of test and check before fully committing if you can. But I also think that there's a road back. So my advice is go for it.
Awesome. And believe it or not, we're at time. So if anybody out there would like to reach you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Two best ways would be to either reach me on LinkedIn or to just go to my website, bellevueconsulting.com. We have a contact form, lots of good information there, but LinkedIn is certainly always an option.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here and for taking time to talk about how you went from one form of engineering to another and realized that that's what you were meant to do. And
thank you so much.
Yeah, and now regarding coming up, now that we are full on into season 2, and as I mentioned, next week's actually our 1-year anniversary, even though we're in season 2, please tune in for more of our upcoming guests, including Joanne Morton, who is a positive energy artist and owner of Magic Passion Love Art, and many more. Please believe me when I say that you don't want to miss what Joanne or any of our future guests have to say about their journeys. And if you missed any of our past guests and you want to check out what they had to say, you can watch all of season 1 as well as the episodes that we've recorded so far in season 2 on demand on RVN Television's website and on Roku. I do also want to mention, you have so many viewing choices these days, so thank you very much for taking the time to watch our show, and please tell a friend or colleague about us. And please remember, whether you're looking to make changes in your life, no matter how big or small, please tune in for more exciting, informative, and educational conversations with guests such as Belle, who made a different but related pivot in her life. Also, reminder, our show airs on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and again on Mondays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So, whether you're looking to make that change big or small, we hope you'll join us again for more conversations with diverse leaders about how they made a decision, chose their purpose, overcame whatever challenges or obstacles stood in their path to succeed and thrive